Tonight, we're going to undo something that Hollywood spent 100 years carefully building inside your head. You've seen the arenas, the roaring crowds, the sand wet with blood, the emperor lazily turning his thumb downward as a man kneels in the dust below. You've seen the muscled hero with the tragic backstory, the evil Lanista cracking his whip, the desperate final stand that somehow becomes a triumph. You've watched Russell Crowe speak to the crowd and felt something in your chest stir, something ancient and righteous. And here's the thing, all of it was gorgeous. Some of it was even partially true. But most of what we think we know about Roman gladiators is a beautifully constructed lie, built not by any single liar, but by centuries of imagination stacking itself on top of incomplete memory. And tonight, we're going to take that image apart, layer by layer, the way an archaeologist brushes sand from bone, carefully and with genuine curiosity about what's actually underneath. So before we go any further, take a moment to settle in properly. Adjust whatever you're resting on, let the lights be low. And if this video found you through someone you trust, a recommendation, a friend, a quiet corner of the internet, drop a note in the comments and tell me where you heard about this. I always love knowing how these stories travel. And if what you find tonight earns it, a like and a subscription would mean the world. Now let's go back, all the way back, to a world of sand and shadow that was nothing like the movies, and far more fascinating. Picture Rome, not the clean marble Rome of the postcards and the textbook illustrations. The actual Rome of 2,000 years ago. A city of nearly 1 million people crammed into a space smaller than modern Manhattan, smelling of fish sauce and tallow smoke, noise ricocheting off stone in every direction. Somewhere in that sprawl, on the eastern edge of the Forum, rises a building so massive it changed the shape of the skyline. The Colosseum, the Flavian Amphitheater, completed around 80 CE under the Emperor Titus. 76 arched entrances, 4 stories of travertine limestone and volcanic tuff. Seating for somewhere between 50 and 80,000 spectators, depending on which historian you trust. The sand on the floor and the word arena comes directly from the Latin arena, meaning sand, was there for a very specific reason. It absorbed blood and could be raked clean between events. There were drain channels beneath, trapdoors above them, and a whole mechanical underworld of elevators and cages that could deliver animals or scenery to the floor of the arena in seconds. And underneath all of this sophistication, underneath all this engineering genius, ran something darker and older than Rome itself. A tradition of blood as entertainment, of death as public spectacle, that scholars believe began not as entertainment at all, but as funeral rite. The earliest munera, the word Romans used for gladiatorial games, meaning gifts or duties, were staged not in amphitheaters, but at grave sites. Roman historians record that in 264 BCE, 2 brothers named Marcus and Decimus Brutus honored their father's death by staging 3 pairs of fighters at the cattle market in Rome. This was believed to appease the spirit of the dead, to give the departed warrior's soul the sacrifice of blood it needed to rest. It wasn't cruelty. It was grief, wearing a different mask. Over the next 3 centuries, what began as occasional private funeral tributes became something else entirely. Something political, something economic. Something that tells us more about the mechanics of power than almost any other institution ancient Rome ever produced. But let's start with the people who actually did the fighting. Because before you can understand what the arena meant, you need to understand who stood in it. When most people imagine a gladiator, they imagine something like Spartacus, a proud warrior enslaved against his will, burning with righteous fury. And that image is not wrong exactly, but it's badly incomplete. The population of Roman gladiatorial schools was extraordinarily diverse, drawn from circumstances that ranged from the catastrophic to the entirely voluntary. War captives came first, and in the largest numbers during the Republic's great campaigns of conquest. When Rome defeated the Germanic tribes in the Dacian campaigns, when legions swept through Thrace and Gaul and Britain, the survivors of those battles, men who had been soldiers, farmers, Chieftains were marched back to Rome and sorted. Some became agricultural slaves, some became household servants, and some, the ones deemed physically impressive enough, ended up in the ludi, the gladiatorial training schools. These men arrived with military experience, with knowledge of weapons from their own cultures, and with something arguably more dangerous than physical strength. They arrived with identities. And Rome, being Rome, turned even that into spectacle. The Thrax fighter, for example, used a curved Thracian sword and a small rectangular shield. The style was named for the conquered people who had originally wielded those weapons in battle. Rome had not just defeated Thrace, it had put Thrace in the arena to be watched. Alongside war captives came condemned criminals. Men whose crimes were serious enough to merit death could be sentenced to the arena in a category called damnatio ad ludum, condemnation to the gladiatorial school. This was considered a milder fate than straightforward execution, since technically it left open the possibility of survival, but only technically. And then, here's where it gets genuinely strange. There were the volunteers, free men who signed away their freedom, citizens, sometimes even knights, who approached a lanista, a gladiatorial trainer, with a proposition. They would fight. In exchange, they received room, board, medical care, and a signing bonus. These men were called octorati, meaning the contracted ones, and they were more common than most people realize. Some estimates suggest that by the height of the imperial period, roughly half the men in Roman gladiatorial schools had entered voluntarily. Why would someone do this? The same reasons people do almost anything extreme: desperation, debt, thrill-seeking, and in some cases, genuine ambition. Because here is the thing that doesn't fit our mental image at all. A successful gladiator in imperial Rome was famous. Not just locally famous, but known across the empire. Their names appeared in graffiti on walls from Pompeii to Rome to the provinces. They had fan followings. They had groupies. They were the closest thing the ancient world had to professional athletes or rock stars. We know this not from abstract theory, but from actual physical evidence. At Pompeii, preserved beneath volcanic ash since 79 CE, archaeologists found inscriptions scrawled on walls that read almost like modern fan accounts. One refers to a fighter named Celadus the Thracian as the one who makes the girls sigh. Another calls a man named Crescens the net fighter who holds the hearts of the maidens. These weren't carved in granite for posterity. They were the equivalent of someone spray painting a celebrity's name on a bridge. Casual devotion, everyday worship. Female gladiators existed too. They were called Feminae, and though they never fought in main events at the Colosseum, they appeared in regional games and private exhibitions, until the Emperor Septimius Severus formally banned them around 200 CE. Two of them have come down to us by their arena names, Amazon and Aquileia, which is a detail so strange and vivid that it's hard not to sit with for a moment. Aquileia, a woman who fought for Roman crowds under the name of the greatest Greek warrior who ever lived. The paradox at the heart of gladiatorial life was this: these men and women occupied the lowest possible rung of Roman social life, while simultaneously being among its most celebrated figures. The legal category was called infamous, infamous. By law, gladiators stood on the same social level as prostitutes, actors, and gravediggers. They could not hold public office. They could not serve as legal witnesses. A Roman matron who touched a gladiator publicly was considered to have debased herself. And yet, those same matrons composed the graffiti. Those same citizens mobbed the training schools trying to catch a glimpse. Roman physicians wrote about treating gladiators' wounds. Roman poets wrote odes about their skills. Entire philosophical texts exist debating whether admiring a gladiator was compatible with being a serious thinker. The infamy was real. The adoration was equally real. And no one in Rome seemed especially troubled by holding both at the same time. Now let's go to the place where fighters were made. The ludus, the gladiatorial school, was nothing like the crude dungeons movies show us. It was, in fact, a sophisticated institution that combined prison, barracks, medical facility, and training academy in a single complex that could house hundreds of men. The greatest of these was the Ludus Magnus, the Great School, which still sits beside the Colosseum today, or rather, its ruins do. Excavated in the 20th century, the Ludus Magnus revealed that it was connected to the Colosseum by an underground tunnel, so fighters could be moved directly from training cells to the arena floor without ever appearing in the streets of Rome. This tunnel still exists. You can stand in it. A training ellipse ran through the center of the school, surrounded by tiered seating where observers, paying visitors, curious citizens, could watch practice sessions. The gladiators trained publicly. In other words, their preparation was itself a form of entertainment. All the way down, it was performance. In 2011, archaeologists working near the Roman city of Carnuntum, in what is now Austria, discovered something that made headlines worldwide. The first gladiatorial school ever found outside Italy. The site of Carnuntum was a legionary fortress on the Danube frontier, and its ludus had been completely buried and forgotten for 17 centuries. The team that found it used ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry, non-invasive technology that can see through the earth without disturbing what lies beneath. And they mapped the entire complex without digging a single shovel into it. What the scans revealed was astonishing. Wooden training posts, a heating system, private cells for individual fighters, medical rooms, and a bathhouse. This wasn't a torture facility. This was, by the standards of its time, a relatively well-equipped residential institution. The men who trained there were valuable. Keeping them healthy and functional was a financial priority, not a moral one, but the practical effect was similar. They were fed, examined, and kept alive because dead gladiators cost money. About that food. Here is one of the most surprising findings in recent gladiatorial research. In 2014, a joint team from MedUni Vienna and the University of Bern published a study analyzing bone samples from a Roman gladiator cemetery discovered in Ephesus, in modern-day Turkey. The cemetery had been excavated in the early 2000s, and its 68 skeletons were confirmed to be gladiators by a combination of physical evidence, inscribed grave markers, and the distinctive nature of their injuries. It was, and remains, the largest confirmed gladiatorial burial site ever found. The researchers subjected those bones to isotopic analysis. They measured carbon and nitrogen and sulfur ratios in the collagen, and they measured strontium to calcium ratios in the bone mineral itself. These techniques allow scientists to reconstruct the diet of a person who died nearly 2,000 years ago with extraordinary precision, because the chemical signature of what you eat is literally written into your skeleton. What the bones showed stopped people short. The gladiators of Ephesus ate a diet that was almost entirely vegetarian, primarily barley, also beans, wheat, and oats, but the barley signature was dominant to a degree that surprised even the researchers. There was very little animal protein in these bones, and almost no evidence of the kind of protein-heavy, meat-centered diet you might expect from professional fighters being prepared for mortal combat. Here is the thing. This was not an accident of poverty or neglect. It was deliberate policy. Roman writers had already hinted at this. The gladiators were known by a specific nickname among the Roman populace, hordearii, which means barley eaters. The philosopher and physician, Galen, who worked with gladiators extensively in the 2nd century CE, complained openly in his writings that the barley-heavy diet made their flesh soft. He found this medically troubling, or at least professionally vexing, because in Roman medical theory, soft flesh was a sign of inferior physical condition. But the gladiatorial physicians and schools employed full-time medical staff had worked out something that Galen's theoretical framework couldn't quite accommodate. They had empirically discovered what modern sports medicine would later confirm. A carbohydrate-heavy diet builds a thick subcutaneous fat layer beneath the skin, and in the gladiatorial context, that fat layer served a specific survival function. When a fighter takes a cut to the arm, or a slash across the chest, or a blow to the shoulder, cuts that are inevitable in any combat regardless of skill, that layer of subcutaneous fat means the wound is more likely to bleed spectacularly without cutting through to nerves or arteries. The wound looks dramatic. The crowd sees blood. The fighter may lose the match, may even be marked for death by the outcome, but the mechanics of the injury itself are less likely to be immediately life-threatening. The gladiatorial diet, in other words, was partly a performance technology. It made the fighters bleed in ways the audience found satisfying, while reducing the probability of any given wound becoming instantly fatal. This is a level of calculated theater that is both cynical and, in a strange way, almost protective. The other finding from the Ephesus bones was equally fascinating. Elevated strontium levels, which indicate regular consumption of plant ash in beverage form. Roman sources describe gladiators drinking a concoction made from the ashes of burned plants, a kind of mineral-rich tonic that functioned as an ancient calcium supplement. After intense training sessions, muscles and bones need calcium and magnesium to repair. The gladiatorial physicians had developed a drink that provided exactly those minerals, not through any theoretical understanding of nutrition, but through generations of watching what helped fighters recover fastest. So here were these men, considered the lowest of the low by Roman law, being given specialized medical care, a scientifically calibrated diet that we are still finding remarkable 2,000 years later, and professional medical consultation for their injuries. The paradox deepens every time you look at it carefully. And now, we need to talk about the fighting itself, because this is where almost everything you think you know needs to be gently set aside. The first and most persistent myth: gladiatorial matches were not routinely fights to the death. Modern historical analysis of surviving records, fight results inscribed on amphitheater walls, commemorative stones, and official accounts suggests that by the height of the imperial period, roughly 1 in 10 bouts ended in the death of a fighter. 1 in 10. Which sounds stark until you compare it to the Hollywood version where every match ends with a man in the sand. Even that 1 in 10 figure requires context. Some of those deaths were accidental. Injuries sustained in matches that seemed manageable but turned fatal during recovery. Some were executions of fighters who had violated rules of combat or behaved in ways the crowd found dishonorable. And some were simply the result of mismatched competition, illness, or bad luck. The Emperor Nero, not generally remembered as a particularly humane figure, apparently staged an entire year's worth of gladiatorial games at a wooden amphitheater without a single death. And this was notable enough that Roman writers recorded it, not as a scandalous failure of entertainment, but as a point of interest. You could have gladiatorial combat with 0 fatalities. It wasn't the norm, but it wasn't impossible. When defeat did come, the protocol was specific and ritualized. A losing fighter would drop his weapon, raise one finger, typically the index finger of the left hand, and look toward the editor, the man presiding over the games. This gesture was a formal request for the missio, the mercy of being allowed to live. The editor, who might be a magistrate, a wealthy citizen, an emperor himself, would then assess the situation. How had the fighter performed? Had he shown genuine courage? Had he earned the crowd's respect through the quality of his fighting even in defeat? Or had he cowered, abandoned his weapon early, disgraced himself in some way the Roman audience found contemptible? The crowd would make its preference known. Roman sources describe shouts of, "Mite, let him go," or "Jugula, kill him." And here, at last, we reach one of the most famous misconceptions in all of popular history: the thumbs. In 1872, a French academic painter named Jean-Léon Gérôme completed a canvas called Police Verso. You have seen this painting or its children 1,000 times. It shows a victorious gladiator standing over his fallen opponent, waiting. And in the crowd, a group of Vestal virgins extends their fists with thumbs pointing sharply downward. The implication is clear. Thumbs down means death. That painting became the template. Every subsequent artistic treatment of gladiatorial judgment borrowed from it, including Ridley Scott's Gladiator in 2000, which is a magnificent film and a deeply confused historical document. Here is what Roman sources actually say when you read them carefully. The Latin phrase pollice verso, the phrase the painting takes its name from, means with turned thumb. It does not specify the direction of the turn, and when Roman writers do specify direction, they describe it in ways that are precisely the opposite of what Jerome depicted. The expression infesto pollis, which appears in multiple Roman texts describing the death signal, translates to hostile thumb or aggressive thumb, and the context in which it appears makes clear this refers to a thumb extended upward and forward, mimicking the action of a sword thrust. The thumb pointing up like a blade meant kill him, strike him down. The mercy signal, the signal for the editor to spare the fighter, appears in Roman writings as pollicis premier, press your thumbs, or compress the thumbs. The gesture was a closed fist, the thumb hidden or pressed inward. Thumb down, or more precisely, thumb contained, was the signal for life. Roman history, in other words, did the exact opposite of what every movie shows you. The crowd pressing their thumbs flat into their fists was showing mercy. The extended thumb, thrust upward like a weapon, was the demand for death. How did Jerome get it backward? He was working from the phrase pollice verso, which he interpreted through 19th century intuition without access to the full body of Roman textual evidence. He made a plausible guess that turned out to be wrong. And that wrong guess then became so visually powerful, the painting was a sensation in its time, that it effectively replaced the historical reality in the popular imagination. This is not a small detail to get wrong. For a century and a half, one of the most iconic images associated with Roman civilization has been an inversion of what actually happened. Now, beyond the mechanics of combat, let's talk about what the arena actually was, functionally, politically, structurally. Because this is where the gladiatorial games reveal something genuinely profound about how Roman power organized itself. The poet Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century CE, gave us one of the most enduring phrases in political philosophy. Panem et circuses. Bread and circuses. He was complaining. Juvenal was always complaining that the Roman populace had sold its political will for free grain distributions and free entertainment. The phrase has outlived the civilization it criticized. But Juvenal, characteristically, was both right and incomplete. The spectacles of the Roman arena were not simply distractions designed to numb a restless population. Though they did that, they were also precisely calibrated demonstrations of how power worked. The editor, the person sponsoring the games, stood visibly at the center of a transaction. He spent money, enormous amounts of it, to provide the crowd with something they could not provide for themselves. And in return, the crowd gave him something the Roman political system ran on: popularity, visibility, the right to be seen as a man who could deliver. Emperors understood this with extraordinary sophistication. Julius Caesar staged games that included captured enemies fighting as gladiators. Augustus built the entire game system into the structure of the state, creating imperial oversight over the schools and regularizing who could put on events and what those events could contain. Individual emperors competed with each other's reputations, partly through the scale and spectacle of what they could offer the Roman public. The Colosseum itself was an explicitly political structure. The Flavian emperors built it on the site of Nero's private lake, which had sat in the middle of Nero's private pleasure gardens, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, which Nero had built after the Great Fire of 64 CE, and which the Roman public viewed as an obscene appropriation of public land for private luxury. Building the Colosseum was literally, physically, an act of political correction. "We are giving you back the lake," the message said, "and we are putting something for you on top of it." The seating inside the Colosseum was also a map of Roman society in stone. The emperor and his household sat at the optimal viewing position. Senators sat nearest the sand. Knights filled the tier above. Ordinary citizens took the upper sections. Women and slaves were relegated to the very top. The architecture reproduced the entire Roman social hierarchy, physically arranged around the spectacle of combat, every person in their place, everyone able to see the emperor and be seen by him. The games were thus simultaneously entertainment, propaganda, wealth display, social ordering, and political communication, all happening in the same space at the same moment. When you watch gladiators fight in the Colosseum, you were watching a performance about who Rome was and how Rome worked, staged in a building that was itself a political argument about who deserved power. The fighters at the center of all this were not passive victims of it. They were, in many ways, its most acute students. We know from archaeological and textual evidence that gladiators organized themselves internally. Within the schools, there were rankings. The Primus Palace was the top-ranked fighter. The Secundus Palace was second, and so on. These rankings affected a fighter's training, his cell size, his portions, his access to medical care, and his choice of opponents. They were a career ladder, and successful gladiators climbed it deliberately. There was a legal mechanism for release, too. A retired gladiator of sufficient skill and reputation could be presented with a wooden training sword called a rudis, which functioned as a kind of certificate of freedom. The rudis fighter, the rudiari, was no longer bound to fight. He could become a trainer himself, take a wife legally, own property, and live something approaching a normal life outside the school, though never quite escaping the social stigma of having been infames. A gravestone found in the ancient city of Milan, modern Milan, belongs to a gladiator named Urbicus, who is described in his epitaph as Primus Palus, the champion fighter of his class. He fought 13 documented matches. He married. He had 2 daughters whose names are on the stone. He died at age 22, not in the arena, but apparently of natural causes or illness, while still technically a free man. His wife commissioned the gravestone, which means she had resources, means she had standing, means she had a life. Urbicus is not a tragic figure in the straightforward sense. He had a career, a family, a documented existence, and a wife who loved him enough to carve it into stone. He was 22. He was famous. He was dead. Ancient Rome contained all of those things simultaneously, without apparent discomfort. The variety of fighting styles in the arena was itself an expression of how carefully the games had been constructed as theater. Gladiatorial matches were not random pairings. They were deliberate matchups between specific types, what we might today call weight classes or specializations, except the differences were more radical. The Murmio was a heavy fighter wearing a large oblong shield and wielding a short gladius sword, his helmet crested with a fish motif. The name comes from the Greek word for a type of fish. He was paired most commonly against the Hoplomachus or the Thraeax, the Thracian fighter with the curved sword and small shield. These pairings created visual contrast that the audience could read immediately. Big shield against small, straight sword against curved, heavy armor against lighter gear. Then there was the Retiarius, the net and trident man, who wore almost no armor at all, a shoulder guard, a linen tunic, sandals, and relied entirely on speed, footwork, and the net he used to tangle opponents before finishing them with the trident, or short dagger. The Retiarius was almost always matched against the Secutor, the chaser, whose name describes exactly his role. He pursued the net fighter across the arena, his smooth, close-fitting helmet specially designed so the Retiarius's net would not snag on any protrusion. These 2 fighters had been engineered to fight each other. The Secutor's helmet limited his vision and hearing, specifically so the combat will be an ongoing, calibrated challenge, rather than a quick conclusion. The game's designers had thought about the audience's experience at the level of equipment design. How long should this fight last? What should it look like? What visual story should the combat tell? There were referees. This is another detail films consistently omit in every visual record we have of gladiatorial combat, and there are many on mosaics, pottery, tomb paintings, carved reliefs, There are men standing near the fighters with long staffs. These are the Summa Rudis and the Secunda Rudis, the chief and secondary referees. They stepped in to separate fighters when rules were broken, when a fighter called for submission, or when the action needed to be paused. A bout could be stopped and restarted. Judges could assess whether a surrender was genuine or tactical. This is not the lawless chaos of the Hollywood arena. This is organized, competitive sport. Different from our sports, disturbing to our sensibilities, governed by values we do not share, but structured, regulated, and conducted according to rules that everyone in the Coliseum understood. The crowd understood that the fighter kneeling in the sand was asking for mercy, not simply collapsing. They understood that the editor would weigh his decision. They knew that cry in mid-A was participating in a process that had outcomes. This was not passive observation of brutality. This was active engagement with a system that included them as decision makers, which is, itself, part of how the political system worked. By giving the crowd a voice in whether individual fighters lived or died, the games created an experience of power, a momentary participation in life and death decisions that was otherwise entirely unavailable to ordinary Romans. You couldn't vote for emperor, you couldn't challenge the law, but in the Colosseum, your shout could save a man's life or end it. There is something genuinely strange that happens when you sit inside the Colosseum today, something the tourist materials don't quite capture. The building has lost its wooden upper tiers and most of its marble facing. It stands incomplete, deliberately exposed to the sky in a way it was never meant to be. And yet the logic of the space is immediately and viscerally legible. You understand within seconds where the sand was, where the crowd sat, where the animals waited below. The spatial argument of the building is so well made that 2,000 years of partial ruin haven't been able to obscure it. This is, I think, because the Colosseum was designed around a psychological insight that is as true now as it was when Vespasian commissioned it, that human beings organize meaning around spectacle. We need to see things happen in front of us. We need the shared space, the collective breath, the moment when 10,000 people feel the same emotion simultaneously, and the air in the building changes. Rome knew this about human nature with a precision that most modern stadium architects are still trying to catch up to. And the gladiators who moved through that space were, in a sense, the most fully realized human beings Rome produced. Not because they were the most virtuous or the most free, but because they embodied the most extreme version of what Rome was. They were simultaneously enslaved and celebrated, legally disposable and practically irreplaceable, watched by everyone and understood by no one. They lived inside the central contradiction of Roman civilization, and they did it in public, in front of crowds, with blades in their hands. The graffiti of Pompeii does something to you when you read it carefully. Not just the fan devotion, the sighing girls, the devoted admirers, but the fighting records. Archaeologists found painted match summaries on the walls near the city's amphitheater that recorded outcomes in abbreviated form. A fighter's name, his record, his style, and the result of his most recent bout. The abbreviations used were V for Victoria, victory, M for misses, mercy granted, and P for period. He died. Some fighters' records show long unbroken runs of V's. Others end with a single P that tells the whole story. These records were not kept for history. They were kept because people cared. The citizens of Pompeii tracked these men's careers the way people today track batting averages or quarterback ratings. The sport had statistics, and the statistics mattered. And the volcano that buried Pompeii in 79 CE preserved all of it perfectly, completely, by accident, in a way that nothing else in the ancient world is quite matched. We should speak, too, about what died separately from the gladiators, because one of the most important distinctions in Roman arena history is between gladiatorial combat proper and what happened to condemned criminals. The Noxi were a category of prisoner condemned to die in the arena, and their fate was deliberately different from that of the gladiators. Criminals condemned ad bestias to the beasts were thrown to lions, bears, leopards, or whatever exotic animals the imperial supply chains could deliver. Criminals condemned ad gladium to the sword were executed publicly by trained fighters or sometimes by each other, forced into combat without training or armor. These executions typically happened at midday, between the morning animal shows and the afternoon gladiatorial bouts. Roman audiences understood the difference. The midday executions were, in fact, something of a clearance period, the time when less enthusiastic spectators went to eat lunch, because what happened at midday carried none of the skill, none of the drama, none of the tension of a real gladiatorial match. It was punishment as public theater, and while Romans found it acceptable in its own context, they did not confuse it with what the afternoon program offered. This distinction matters because much of the moral horror that modern people quite reasonably feel about the Roman arena is actually horror at the Nazi executions, the feeding of human beings to animals, the forced combat of untrained prisoners, rather than horror at gladiatorial combat specifically. Two things happened in the same building, but they were different things, with different participants, different rules, and different meanings to the Roman audience. That said, the gladiatorial system was not morally clean in any sense we would recognize today. People died in it. Men were enslaved into it against their will. The crowd's acceptance of that death was real, even when the death rate was far lower than myth suggests. The economics of the system meant that what the crowd paid for was the possibility of death, even if they rarely got the actuality. The psychological contract between audience and arena was built on genuine mortal risk, and the fighters themselves knew this. Every time they stepped onto the sand, they understood what the sand was for. Before we talk about how it ended, let's talk about one archaeological discovery that grounds everything we've said in a way that is almost impossible to look away from. The Gladiators cemetery at Ephesus. Ephesus was one of the great cities of the Roman world, located on the western coast of what is now Turkey, and it contained a large and active gladiatorial school. In the early 2000s, archaeologists excavating near the city uncovered a burial site that they quickly identified as the final resting place of gladiators. 68 skeletons in graves that contained inscribed stones, reliefs depicting arena weapons and palm fronds signifying victory, and physical evidence on the bones themselves that could only come from gladiatorial combat. These bones told stories. The forensic team found healed fractures on forearms, the defensive injuries you get when you instinctively raise your arm against a blow. They found evidence of expertly treated wounds that had been cleaned, stitched, and allowed to heal correctly. They found what appeared to be the marks of gladiatorial medical care, interventions consistent with ancient surgical practice, wounds that someone had worked to close properly, rather than simply leaving to fate. They also found, in several cases, the evidence of how specific individuals had died. One skeleton showed signs of having been struck multiple times on the skull by a weapon consistent with a trident. Not a sword, not an animal, but specifically a trident, the weapon of the retiarius. The pattern of the injuries suggested blows from above, delivered in rapid succession. The man's armor had protected most of his body. His head, at the critical moment, had not been protected enough. Another skull bore evidence of a single catastrophic blow from a hammer-like object, with the entry wound perfectly round and the force concentrated in a way that would have caused instantaneous death. Forensic analysts suggested this was a coup de grace, a mercy blow delivered after the fight concluded, either because the fighter had been judged worthy of a quick death, or because his injuries had left him beyond recovery. This is what archaeology looks like when it stops being abstract and starts being human. These were people. They had nicknames and fan letters, and probably, some of them, a wife and daughters whose names appear on stones in a city 2,000 years gone. They ate barley. They drank ash water for their bones. They fought according to rules in front of crowds who yelled their names. And they were buried, at least at Ephesus, with the care that death deserves. Their graves marked, their occupations acknowledged, their identities preserved. Gladiatorial games did not last forever. Few institutions do. The specific decline of the games is harder to date precisely than most people imagine. because the end was not a single moment, but a long unraveling. Several forces worked simultaneously to dismantle what had taken centuries to build. The economics were, as always, central. By the later imperial period, the cost of staging great games had become almost impossible to bear for anyone below imperial level. The supply of war captives had thinned as Rome's frontiers stabilized. Trained gladiators were rarer and more expensive. The elaborate infrastructure of the amphitheaters, their maintenance, their staffing, their animal procurement networks, required constant expenditure that the declining imperial economy could less and less support. There were disasters too. In 27 CE, a wooden amphitheater at Fidenae north of Rome collapsed during games. The structure had been built cheaply by a man named Attilius, who would cut corners on materials and construction. Estimates of the death toll in the collapse vary wildly, but Roman sources describe the number of dead and injured as somewhere above 20,000. It was one of the worst structural disasters in Roman history, and it prompted legislation about amphitheater construction that effectively put small-scale gladiatorial venues out of business. Christianity's rise added moral weight to practical arguments. The early Christian church was deeply hostile to the games, viewing them as incompatible with Christian values about the sanctity of life and the impropriety of spectacle. As Christianity spread through the empire and eventually became the state religion, official attitudes toward the games shifted perceptibly. Church fathers wrote against them. Emperors who prided themselves on their Christian virtue were reluctant to be too publicly enthusiastic about sponsoring death as entertainment. The theologian Tertullian, writing around 200 CE, made an argument against the games that might surprise you with its sophistication. He argued that the emotional investment of arena audiences, their grief for fallen favorites, their excitement, their moral suspension, was itself a form of spiritual corruption. The games didn't just celebrate violence, they trained the soul to find pleasure in what should cause pain. This is a moral critique that still has force. The formal legal end came in 404 CE under the Western Emperor, Honorius, who issued an edict banning gladiatorial combat. The traditional story surrounding this ban involves a Christian monk named Telemachus, who leapt into the arena during games in Rome to stop a fight and was killed by the crowd. His martyrdom supposedly moving Honorius to act immediately. The historical verifiability of the Telemachus story is questionable. It appears in only one early source, and some historians consider it legendary. But what is not questionable is that Honorius did ban the games, and that ban held. The era of the gladiator was over. The amphitheaters did not vanish overnight. About 186 were built across the Roman Empire during its history, and many of them were repurposed rather than demolished. Some became fortresses, their massive walls converted to defensive use. Some became housing, medieval cities literally growing up inside the shells of ancient entertainment venues. The Colosseum itself was used as a quarry for building material during the medieval period. Much of what once stood was stripped and used elsewhere, which is why the structure looks as it does today, magnificent and also incomplete. The gladiators left behind something unexpected, the ghost of themselves preserved in our living language. Gladiator comes from gladius, the sword. The term we use for those fighters is itself the name of their primary weapon, and the word arena, used today for sporting venues across the world, for music stadiums and political debates, is the Latin word for sand, the sand that absorbed the blood of 2,000 years of combat. And there is, finally, the Colosseum itself, the building that outlasted everything it contained. Emperors, fighters, crowds, political systems, the entire civilization that built it. It stands today not as a triumph, but as a question mark and travertine, asking everyone who walks through its arched entrances the same thing Rome always asked. What are you willing to watch? What will you call entertainment? And what does your answer say about who you are? We are, in our stadiums, in our sporting events, in our carefully constructed entertainment spectacles, still building on something Rome built first. The desire to watch human beings perform under pressure, to see skill tested against skill and nerve tested against nerve, to be briefly part of something collective and electric and loud. That desire is not a Roman invention, but Rome refined it to a science, wrapped it in politics and economics and architecture, and left us the vocabulary we still use to talk about it. What the gladiators were, finally, is not easy to say in a single sentence. They were not the heroes films make them. They were not simply victims. They were people caught in a system of extraordinary complexity. A system that needed them to suffer and to survive in calibrated amounts, that valued their bodies for their usefulness, and occasionally, unexpectedly, valued their humanity too. The barley they ate is still in their bones in Ephesus. The matches they fought are still scratched onto the walls of Pompeii. The names their admirers scrawled in red on a plaster wall survived the volcano. The man who trained 13 fights and came home to 2 daughters and died young, his name was Urbicus, and he was a champion, and someone loved him enough to say so in stone. History does this to you, if you let it. It takes what seemed like spectacle and turns it into people. And people, once you see them clearly, are much harder to look away from than anything the arena ever staged. There is one more thing worth saying before we close, and it's about us as much as it is about Rome. Every civilization has its arena. Not every arena has sand and blood, but every society constructs spaces and systems in which the tension between individual human lives and collective needs gets played out in public. Our version looks very different from Rome's, but the underlying question is identical. How much does a society value a person? And what does that value look like in practice when it conflicts with other priorities? Rome's answer was complicated and often brutal, but it was also specific, documented, and in many ways surprisingly honest. The Romans did not pretend the games was something other than what they were. They did not claim the fighters chose freely what they had in fact been compelled into. They did not dress the economics in moral language. The transactional nature of the entire enterprise was visible to everyone involved, from the emperor in his box to the fighter in the sand. What the gladiatorial world shows us, ultimately, is that human beings have always been capable of maintaining 2 incompatible ideas simultaneously, of knowing something is wrong at the level of principle, while participating in it at the level of practice, of valuing an individual's life in one context and discounting it entirely in another. This is not specifically Roman. This is specifically human. The next time you watch a film that puts a man in the arena and asks you to root for his survival, notice what the film is doing. It is putting you in the stands. It is making you part of the crowd that has always gathered around human risk and called it entertainment. The film is not wrong that this is compelling. History proves it has always been compelling, but it's worth knowing as the camera pulls back on the roaring Colosseum and the score swells that the real version was stranger and more human and less simple than any movie has ever been willing to show. His name was Urbicus. He was Primus Palus, champion of his fighting class. He came home from 13 recorded fights, and he died at 22 years old. And his wife carved his full story in stone, so that none of it would vanish entirely into silence. It is still there. We can still read it. Some things, it turns out, the centuries cannot rake away. If something in tonight's telling surprised you or stayed with you, a like goes a long way. And if you want more history told this way, unhurried and curious and honest about what we do and don't know, a subscription means I will be here the next time you need somewhere calm to rest your thoughts. Sleep well. The sand has long been raked clean.